She thought she was just another student, until her teacher crossed the line in a way no one expected. What happened next left the whole school speechless. Watch till the end. You won't believe how it all unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story if it moved you. Cameron O'Neill sat in the second row by the window, her notebook open, pen in hand, eyes focused. Outside, the sky was still gray from the early morning haze, but inside room 213, the atmosphere was always sharp. It wasn't the cold air from the overworked AC unit that made Cameron's shoulders tense. It was the presence of Mrs. Miller. Metaphor, alliteration, hyperbole. Mrs. Miller's voice rang through the room, precise and clipped, every syllable polished like glass. She turned to the chalkboard, writing each term with quick, practiced taps of the chalk. Literary devices are not optional. They are not ornaments. They are structure. Cameron scribbled down notes, her handwriting neat, lines tight and efficient. She didn't want to miss anything, not because she loved the lesson, though she usually did, but because she didn't want to give Mrs. Miller a reason to look at her again like that. The glances had started weeks ago. At first, they were barely noticeable, a slight pause before her name was called, an eyebrow raised when she answered correctly. Then came the tone, polite, but with a sharpness to it, like she'd done something wrong by existing. Now it was unmistakable. Mrs. Miller's eyes found her often, more than anyone else's, and when they did, it felt like a weight pressing on Cameron's chest. "Miss O'Neill," Mrs. Miller said suddenly, interrupting her train of thought. Cameron looked up, her stomach tightening. The entire class turned. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "You seem rather distracted today," Mrs. Miller said, tilting her head ever so slightly. "Or is it that you believe you've already mastered the material?" A few students shifted in their seats, the air tightening around them. Cameron could feel it, the awkwardness, the discomfort. She kept her eyes on the teacher, trying not to flinch. "I'm paying attention," she said simply. Mrs. Miller smiled, but it wasn't warm. "Of course. Though I imagine it must be difficult to stay grounded when you walk around with a name like yours." Silence. The comment landed hard. Some students looked down, others stared blankly ahead, pretending not to have heard. Cameron felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to stay still. Her pen rested motionless in her hand. The bell rang moments later, a sharp chime that sliced through the tension. Chairs scraped. Students hurried out. Cameron packed her things slowly, her heart pounding. She could feel the comment trailing behind her like a shadow, clinging to her clothes, her hair, her name. At lunch, her friend Emily leaned in close and asked if she was okay. Cameron offered a tight smile. "Just tired," she lied. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to hear her own voice crack. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Other teachers, other subjects, nothing stuck. Everything she read, everything she heard was muffled by the loop playing in her head. You walk around with a name like yours. That evening, at home, things looked normal. Her mother, Gina, was at the stove humming softly, stirring something in a pot. Her father, Shaquille O'Neill, sat at the kitchen table reading an email on his tablet. The room smelled like garlic and roasted chicken. It should have felt comforting. Safe. "How was school?" Gina asked as she placed a plate in front of Cameron. Cameron hesitated. "Fine," she said. Shaquille looked up from his screen. "Anything exciting?" "Nope." He gave her a long look but said nothing more. Later, after dinner, Cameron followed her father into the backyard. The grass was cool beneath her feet, the sky dimming to violet. This was their time, father and daughter. Shaq, towering and quiet, moved through their usual warm-up with ease. Cameron mirrored his stances, the familiar rhythm of their movements slowly unclenching the knot in her chest. "Your focus is off," he said gently as they ran a blocking drill. "Just school stuff," she muttered. He nodded, didn't press. Instead, he showed her a new combination, a tighter rotation of the hips, a quicker pivot of the foot. She absorbed the motion, letting her body do what her mind couldn't: fight back. That night, lying in bed, Cameron stared at the ceiling. Her long hair fanned out across her pillow like a curtain, soft and comforting. She reached up and ran her fingers through it. Her thoughts circled. Why did Mrs. Miller treat her that way? She wasn't loud. She didn't brag. She didn't even talk about who her father was. But it didn't matter. It never seemed to matter. The next day, it happened again. Another backhanded comment. Another lingering stare. Another suggestion that she thought she was special, not because of anything she said or did, but because of the name on her student ID, Shaquille O'Neal's daughter. The comments were never direct, never enough to report, but they came often and always in front of others. Fame doesn't equal talent. Rules apply to everyone regardless of who tucks them in at night. Every jab chipped away at her, slowly, quietly. Cameron stopped raising her hand. She stopped volunteering. At lunch, she laughed less. She didn't notice the change at first, but her friends did. Emily gave her longer looks. Ryan, another classmate she trusted, asked once if everything was okay with English class. "She's just hard on me," Cameron said. "No," Emily said softly. "She's targeting you." Cameron didn't answer. That week, the school announced a writing contest. Theme: resilience. Mrs. Miller made sure to mention it during English class, her eyes locking on Cameron as she said, "Some of you may believe you've experienced enough hardship to write about resilience. But resilience isn't inherited, Miss O'Neill. It's earned." Cameron's throat tightened. She submitted an essay anyway, not for the contest, for herself. A week later, she was announced as one of the finalists. The class clapped. Mrs. Miller handed her essay back with a thin smile and said, "I suppose having a famous last name does open a few doors." Cameron didn't reply. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. That night, she stood in front of her mirror again. Her long hair fell over her shoulders, brushing against her collarbones. She stared at herself for a long time. Then she whispered aloud, "I'm still me." But every day it got harder to believe. Her classmates began to shift too. Some still smiled, but others watched her from a distance. A few even mimicked Mrs. Miller's tone, parroting her jabs. "She thinks she's better than us. She only gets attention because of her dad." The words were whispers, but they were sharp. They followed her through the halls. They dug in. Cameron kept her silence. At home, she still smiled at dinner. She still trained with her father, but the weight in her chest didn't go away. It pressed deeper. One afternoon, while walking past the staff hallway, she overheard her teacher's voice. "She thinks the world owes her something because of who her father is," Mrs. Miller said. "Someone needs to remind that girl she's not special." Cameron froze. Her heart stopped. The words weren't said to her, but they sliced deeper than anything she'd heard. She didn't cry that night. Not yet. She sat at her mirror again, brushing her hair slowly, methodically. The strands felt heavier now, like armor. Tomorrow she would go back. Tomorrow she would sit in that classroom again. But something inside her had already begun to crack. The sun was barely up when Cameron stepped through the front gates of the school. The air was cool, her hoodie zipped all the way up, her long hair tucked inside like she was hiding from the world. She wasn't sure why the dread was heavier today, maybe because of the essay. Maybe because she knew something was coming. She could feel it. The first 2 periods passed quietly. Her teachers greeted her like always, the lessons rolled on, but Cameron was distracted. Her mind kept returning to English class, to room 213, to the way Mrs. Miller's voice always carried a blade behind its calm. Her fingers tapped nervously on her notebook as she waited for the bell to ring and signal 3rd period. When it did, she moved slower than usual, her footsteps dragging just slightly. Mrs. Miller was already in the room when she entered, standing at the desk, her expression unreadable. Cameron took her seat by the window, kept her head down, and tried to steady her breathing. The classroom filled with the usual sounds: zippers, backpacks hitting the floor, chairs scraping. The bell rang. Silence fell. Mrs. Miller began the lesson in her usual crisp, measured tone. They were discussing literary symbolism that day, how objects in a story carry meaning, how every detail mattered. Cameron tried to focus, her pen moving across the page, but the tension never eased. She could feel the teacher's gaze flicking her way again and again. And then came the pause. Mrs. Miller closed the textbook softly, looking up. "That's enough for today," she said suddenly. "You're dismissed for lunch." The class hesitated. The bell hadn't rung yet, but no one questioned it. Students began packing up their things, some exchanging confused glances, others clearly relieved to get an early break. Cameron was halfway through putting her notebook in her backpack when she heard it. "Miss O'Neill, stay behind." Her heart sank. The room emptied slowly. Emily gave her a worried look as she passed, but Cameron forced a faint smile in return. Then the door clicked shut, and they were alone. Mrs. Miller didn't speak at first. She moved with slow purpose, gathering papers on her desk, her heels tapping lightly against the floor. Finally, she spoke. "You and I need to have a conversation." Cameron didn't move. She stood near her desk, her backpack still over one shoulder, her hands clenched around the strap. "I've been patient," Mrs. Miller continued, folding her arms. "But it seems you still haven't grasped what this classroom is about." Cameron furrowed her brow. "I don't understand." Mrs. Miller gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No, I don't imagine you do." She stepped closer. "You walk in here with your long hair, your father's name hanging over everything like a banner. Do you think the rules don't apply to you? I never. You've been warned before, Miss O'Neill, about the dress code, about the distractions you bring with you into my classroom." Cameron's throat tightened. "My hair isn't against the rules." Mrs. Miller's expression sharpened. "It's disruptive. You may not see it, but others do." Cameron said nothing. Mrs. Miller stepped behind her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled something out. Scissors. A simple silver pair, the kind used to cut paper. But in that moment, in that room, they looked like weapons. Cameron froze. "I'm going to help you understand," Mrs. Miller said, walking forward, the scissors gleaming in the fluorescent light. "I'm going to show you that the rules apply to everyone." Cameron took a step back. "You can't?" "I can," the teacher said quietly, "and I will." Her voice left no room for argument. "Sit down." Cameron didn't move. "I said sit." The command struck her like a whip. Her body moved before her brain could stop it. She dropped into the seat, her hands gripping the edges of the desk. Her backpack slipped to the floor with a dull thud. Mrs. Miller stood behind her now, close, too close. The scissors opened with a soft metallic snip. "I'm doing this for your own good," she said. Cameron's eyes stared straight ahead. Her mouth was dry. Her heart thudded so loudly it drowned out everything else. Mrs. Miller reached down and took hold of a thick lock of her hair. Cameron flinched, and then, snip. The sound was soft, almost nothing, but inside Cameron's chest it echoed like a scream. Another snip, and another. Long, dark strands fell onto the floor, scattering like leaves. Mrs. Miller moved with quiet precision, her expression unreadable, her motions practiced. She didn't speak again. Cameron didn't cry. Not yet. Her face was numb. Her hands were pale against the desk. By the time it was over, her once-long hair was uneven, jagged, hacked. Mrs. Miller stepped back and dropped the scissors onto her desk with a soft clatter. "There," she said. "Now you look like everyone else." Cameron didn't move. "You're dismissed." She stood slowly, her legs weak beneath her, and picked up her backpack without looking down. Not at the floor, not at the hair scattered around her shoes. Her eyes burned, but she didn't let the tears fall. Not here. She walked out of the room in a daze, down the hall, through the doors, across the parking lot. She didn't stop walking. She didn't stop until she was nearly home. That was when the tears came, hot, fast, and unstoppable. She ducked her head, pulled up her hood to hide what had been done to her. Her breaths came in short, shaky bursts. She reached the front steps of her house, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door. Her mother's voice called from the kitchen. "Cameron, is that you?" She didn't answer. She walked up the stairs, one step at a time, and closed the door behind her. In the mirror, she finally looked. What stared back wasn't her. Her hair was butchered, chopped short in some places, still long in others, ragged where the scissors had torn through. Her hand rose, touched it. She winced. A sob broke from her throat, raw and sharp. She bit her lip, trying to hold the rest in, but the grief poured out. Hours passed. Darkness fell. The house was quiet. Eventually, she crept downstairs. Her parents were still in the kitchen. Gina turned first, her face softening when she saw her daughter, and then hardening in horror. "Oh my God!" Shaquille stood too. His face changed instantly, from calm curiosity to something sharp and alert. Cameron didn't say anything at first. She just pulled down the hood. The room fell silent. Her mother gasped, covering her mouth. Her father's hands clenched slowly at his sides. Cameron's voice was barely a whisper. "She cut it. My hair." Shaquille stepped forward, gently taking her shoulders, crouching to look into her eyes. "Who?" "Mrs. Miller," Cameron said, her voice breaking. "She said I was breaking the dress code. She said I thought I was special. And then she made me stay. She had scissors." Gina moved in and placed a hand on her daughter's back. She didn't say anything, just rubbed slow circles between Cameron's shoulder blades. Shaquille stood up, his jaw clenched. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He walked to the counter, picked up his phone, and started making calls. His voice was quiet, steady, but every word hit with precision. District, superintendent, principal. Cameron sat frozen at the table as the weight of what had happened began to shift, slightly. She still felt the humiliation, the betrayal, the fear. But now, she wasn't alone. And tomorrow her father would be walking into that school with her. The morning sun was still rising when the O'Neill family stepped out of their front door. The street was quiet, the air crisp, but the tension around them felt like a taut wire ready to snap. Cameron walked between her parents, her hands tucked inside her sleeves, her hoodie up, her eyes focused on the pavement. Her father walked beside her, tall and silent, every movement deliberate. Gina, on the other side, stayed close, glancing at her daughter every few steps, her lips drawn tight. The ride to the school was silent. Shaquille O'Neal gripped the steering wheel with one hand, the other resting on his knee. He hadn't said much that morning, just asked if Cameron was ready. She had nodded, not trusting her voice. The night before had been a storm of phone calls and quiet fury. Her father's calm had been unnerving, but beneath it was a fire she had never seen before. Not like this. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Cameron spotted a few familiar faces lingering near the entrance. Some students, a couple of teachers. Conversations hushed as they saw who stepped out of the car. Shaquille O'Neal was hard to miss, not just because of his height and fame, but because of the way he carried himself. Solid, steady, focused. They walked through the front doors together. The front office staff looked up, their expressions shifting quickly. Recognition, surprise, and then something else. Concern. One of the secretaries stood. "Mr. O'Neal," she said quickly, "the principal is expecting you, right this way." Mr. Andrews, the school principal, was already waiting in his office when they arrived. He stood as they entered, adjusting his tie, his face pale. "Good morning," he said, voice a little too high. "Please, have a seat." Shaquille didn't sit. "My daughter was assaulted by one of your teachers," he said calmly, "and I want to know what you're going to do about it." Mr. Andrews blinked. I only just heard about the incident this morning. I wasn't aware of the specifics." "You'll hear them now," Shaquille said. Then he turned to Cameron. She hesitated. Then, with her mother's gentle hand on her shoulder, she spoke. She told him everything. The comments, the stares, the subtle digs, the essay contest, the hair, the scissors, the silence of the classroom, the shame. Mr. Andrews listened, his face growing grimmer with each word. When Cameron finished, her father pulled out his phone. "A student recorded part of what happened," he said. "One of the parents sent it to me." He pressed play. The room was silent except for the sound of Mrs. Miller's voice and the soft, sickening snip of scissors. The video wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. The image of Mrs. Miller standing over Cameron with the scissors in hand, the strand of hair fallen to the floor, it said everything. When the video ended, Mr. Andrews looked like he might be sick. "This is completely unacceptable," he said, his voice low. "I had no idea. I expect a formal investigation," Shaquille said, his voice still calm but deadly serious. "Immediate disciplinary action, a public apology, and a complete review of your policies." He paused. "And you can expect to hear from my attorneys and the school board." Mr. Andrews nodded quickly. "You have my word." By the time they left the office, Cameron felt like she was breathing air for the first time in days. Her chest still felt tight, but something had shifted. The weight had started to move. Whispers followed them through the halls as they walked back toward the main entrance. Students turned their heads, some wide-eyed, others whispering to each other. No one spoke directly to her, but they were watching. And that was enough. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the pavement. Shaquille paused at the bottom of the school steps and looked down at his daughter. "This isn't over," he said quietly, "but we're going to make sure it ends the right way." Cameron nodded, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks, she believed things could change. That night, the calls started. Parents, teachers, journalists. Somehow, the video had leaked. Cameron wasn't sure who had posted it first, maybe one of the students, maybe a parent, but it didn't matter. By the next morning, it had spread across social media. The story was everywhere. Headlines, hashtags, heated threads on parent forums. Teacher cuts student's hair in class, daughter of Shaquille O'Neal targeted. Cameron kept her phone off most of the day. Every time she turned it on, there were new notifications, messages from friends, distant cousins, total strangers. Some offered support. Some were outraged. Some just said they couldn't believe it had happened. She barely slept that night. The next morning, her father sat across from her at the kitchen table. "Today's the hearing," he said. Cameron nodded. "You don't have to come. You've been through enough. I can handle it." She shook her head. "I want to be there." The school board hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. The conference room was cold and sterile, the kind of place where important things were said in quiet voices and typed into formal minutes. When they arrived, the room was already half full. Mr. Andrews was there along with several school board members, teachers, parents, even a few upperclassmen. At the far end of the long table sat Mrs. Miller, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't look up when they entered. The air buzzed with quiet tension. When the meeting was called to order, the formalities began. Statements about school policy, respect, professional conduct. It all sounded distant to Cameron, like someone speaking underwater. Then came the facts. Her father spoke first. He laid everything out. The timeline, the repeated harassment, the manipulation of authority, the physical violation. He didn't raise his voice once, but every word landed like a brick. When he played the video, you could hear people gasp. Next, the principal gave his statement. He acknowledged the school's failure to recognize the pattern, promised change. Then it was Mrs. Miller's turn. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blouse, her face composed. "I never intended harm," she said. "My actions were meant to enforce classroom discipline and fairness. I believed that certain students had grown too comfortable thinking the rules did not apply to them." Her eyes flicked toward Cameron just for a second. "I understand now that my methods may have been misinterpreted. For any distress caused, I offer regret for the outcome. Not an apology, just regret for the outcome." The words hit like cold water. Parents began to speak next. One by one, they stood and expressed their outrage, not just at what had happened, but at the culture that allowed it to fester. A mother spoke through tears about how her daughter had come home crying. A father talked about fear. Others brought up past incidents. The tide was clear. Then the chair of the board turned to Cameron. "Would you like to say anything?" She didn't plan to speak, but she stood anyway. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I never asked for special treatment," she said. "I just wanted to learn. I tried to ignore the comments. I tried to keep going. But when she cut my hair, she wasn't teaching me a lesson. She was trying to humiliate me." She swallowed. "I'm not just Shaquille O'Neal's daughter. I'm me. And no student should be made to feel small because of who they are, or who their parent is." She sat down. The room was silent for a long time. Then came the vote. The decision was unanimous. Mrs. Miller's contract would be terminated immediately. The school would issue a formal apology to Cameron and her family. A review of school policies would begin immediately, and staff would undergo training on student rights and professional conduct. As the room emptied, a quiet sense of relief settled over Cameron like sunlight after a storm. She wasn't fully healed, but she had been heard, and that was the beginning. 3 days passed before Cameron returned to school. Her parents had gently suggested she stay home longer, but Cameron knew deep down that if she didn't face it now, she might never be able to. Hiding wasn't the answer. She had already been made to feel small, stripped, humiliated, and exposed in front of everyone. The only way to reclaim her space was to walk back into it on her own terms. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror that morning, her backpack already slung over her shoulder. Her hair was shorter now. After the hearing, her mother had taken her to a stylist who did her best to even it out. But some parts were still choppy, uneven, a constant reminder of what had happened. And yet, for the first time in weeks, Cameron didn't feel the urge to hide behind it. She let it fall freely, what was left of it. No hoodie, no makeup, just herself. The halls of the school were quieter than usual when she arrived. Conversations died down as she passed. Heads turned. Some students looked away quickly, others held her gaze awkwardly. A few smiled cautiously. Everyone knew. How could they not? She kept walking. Her locker was in the same place, untouched. When she reached it, she found Emily already waiting there. No words, just a long, tight hug. A second later, Ryan appeared beside them. "Good to have you back," he said quietly. Cameron nodded. "Thanks." They didn't mention Mrs. Miller. They didn't have to. The school had already changed. That morning, a formal letter of apology was read over the intercom by Mr. Andrews himself. It was stiff, rehearsed, and full of legal language, but it acknowledged the violation Cameron had endured. It acknowledged the wrong. Mrs. Miller was no longer on school grounds. Her classroom was empty, the desk cleared out, the walls bare. The girl everyone once whispered about, Shaquille O'Neal's daughter, had become something else, and the girl who stood her ground. The first day back wasn't easy. Teachers walked on eggshells around her. Some smiled too widely, others offered quiet nods, hesitant to say more. In the cafeteria, a group of students paused mid-conversation as she walked by, whispering just low enough to be noticeable. Cameron didn't respond. She focused on breathing, on staying upright. By the end of the week, the whispering had slowed. The stares had softened, and routine, that familiar, reliable rhythm, began to return. But some things had changed for good. The school board, true to their word, implemented new training programs for staff. Workshops on boundaries, respect, and student mental health were introduced. An anonymous reporting system was launched, giving students a way to voice concerns without fear. For the first time in years, students began speaking up. Shaquille kept his promise, not just for Cameron, but for every kid who had ever sat in silence, unsure if they'd be believed. At home, things slowly shifted back to normal. Gina returned to her evening cooking, humming soft tunes in the kitchen. Dinner conversations resumed, filled with small talk about classes and TV shows. But even then, some part of their world had shifted, grown closer, more protective. In the backyard, Cameron and her father resumed training. The first session back was quiet. They moved through drills under the fading light, the air cool and still. Her footwork was off at first. Her punches lacked focus, but Shaquille didn't comment. He watched her, correcting gently, not pushing too hard. After their final set, they both sat on the cool grass, sweat on their foreheads, silence between them. Then he looked over. "You know," he said, "I'm proud of you." Cameron didn't respond right away. For standing up, for coming back. She blinked, her throat tightening. Then she gave a small nod. "Thanks." That moment stayed with her. So when the announcement came a week later about the annual school karate tournament, Cameron did something unexpected. She paused at the bulletin board where the sign-up sheet hung. Her hand hovered over the page for a moment, uncertain. Then she picked up the pen and wrote her name. That evening, over dinner, she told her parents. Gina looked surprised but smiled. Shaquille simply nodded. "You sure?" "Yeah," Cameron said. And she was. The gym was packed on the day of the tournament. Parents, students, teachers, all gathered in the bleachers. Banners hung from the rafters, the smell of rubber mats and sweat already thick in the air. Cameron stood at the edge of the competition mat, her GI crisp, her belt tight around her waist. Her short hair brushed the nape of her neck, no longer something to hide behind, but something she wore proudly. Her name was called. She stepped onto the mat. Her opponent bowed. So did she. And then the match began. It was fast, focused. Each movement felt like memory and fire. Her body remembered what her mind tried to forget: the rhythm, the technique, the control. She blocked, pivoted, struck. Not wildly, not with rage, but with precision. And when the final point was called and the referee raised her hand, the applause came loud and clear. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the way she stood there, in the center of the mat, with her shoulders squared, her eyes steady, and her chin lifted. Not hiding, not shrinking, just standing. After the match, as the crowd dispersed and the gym emptied, Cameron walked toward her parents. Shaquille stood, arms folded, a rare, proud smile on his face. "You did good," he said. Cameron looked up at him, her face soft with something close to relief. "Thanks." They walked out into the evening together, the air warm, the sky streaked with gold and pink. Cameron knew the scars wouldn't vanish. There would still be days when the memories crept in. The sound of scissors, the sting of silence, the sharp echo of humiliation. But now, she knew something else. She was more than what had been taken from her. More than a name. More than a headline. More than a girl who had to prove herself. She was Cameron, and she was enough. Some scars remain, but her strength became louder than the whispers. This story isn't just about what was done to her, it's about what she became after. If this story inspired you, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.